I guess we're getting to know each other pretty well by now. Hi, I'm Nick Shell with Family Friendly Daddy Blog, and I'm here to celebrate diversity and ethnicity, and I ask a lot of questions because I don't really know a whole lot. So thank you for enlightening me, as did Kevin Thomas. And he pointed out some things in his comment on my video, MyHeritage, do African Americans only show 2/3 African DNA on their DNA test results? And his response definitely backed that up, because I've been speculating already of this last week. If you're African American, your test results are probably going to indicate that you're somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 African, and then the rest being predominantly European. He says, Kevin Thomas says, quote, I've actually taken 3 DNA tests, one with each major company. Here's the results: 70% African, 30% European. So again, that backs up what I've been saying there. He goes on to give some details, saying, my paternal haplogroup is Northern Ireland and maternal is West Africa. My third great-grandfather was a white England-descended Confederate soldier that petitioned Alabama to marry my great-great-great-grandmother, but it was not allowed. What's interesting is quite a number of my paternal ancestors were bi or multiracial, whom married other multiracial people. My highest European result on every test is Scandinavia, specifically Norway, when further researched. Lest I forget, I have a heavy dose of Slavic and Jewish to top things off. One of my most recent great-grandfathers was from Norway. My cousins have higher percentages than I do. I picked up more of my mother's DNA, which sometimes happens with male children, end quote. Thank you so much, Kevin Thomas. I love learning and I love exploring. By the way, I actually am from Alabama. I was born and raised in a place called Fort Payne, Alabama. So there you go. There we've got something in common. What I wanted to really pinpoint on this is I think it's fascinating, and I think not really maybe talked much about, but consider this. I mean, there was about 100-year span from the time slavery ended in America until the time of the Civil Rights Movement, which finally happened 100 years later. So, that's been, what, 50 years ago that even happened. But for 100-year span, you had people who were freed from slavery, some of them being from Africa, some being, unfortunately, and we know why, were of half black, half white because of what was happening with slave owners, and it's just such a horrible thing that happened. So, and he's saying, if you were mixed, then who did you end up marrying and having children with? A lot of times, either other mixed, or probably going back to someone who was also African, because there was still this sense of, I'm sure, segregation that was happening on its own as the South was recovering from the Civil War, and now the slaves are free. So there was, I'm sure, to a default, still segregation that was existing, and then and then the Civil Rights Movement. So finally, it took all of that. And then here we are, what, 50 years after the Civil Rights Movement, into which it's normal, completely normal, for there to be a black mom and a white dad that have a mixed kid, or vice versa, black dad, white mom, and they have a mixed of both African American and European. That's normal now. It's not taboo. If this were 1965, it'd probably be scandalous, right? Which is crazy to think about. But it's interesting not only for the fact that, like, there had to be some sort of sense of segregation that was already occurring as mixed between African and European right after the Civil War, as that was happening, and who they could and could not marry, as he was talking about one of his ancestors here. I think that's interesting. If you couldn't marry someone because they had too much European or too much African, I think that's interesting. And just awful to think about too. So you're restricted by who you could even marry. And then there were social norms going into it. But here we are, modern day, we don't have to worry about that. And it's normal for us to see interracial marriage. And it's worth celebrating when I see it. I love it. But what I think the main takeaway for me on this is how we all came from the same place anyway, right? Didn't we all come from what? Somewhere in the Middle East, Africa. That's where we all started, right? And as nations were formed and all this happened, there was a lot of mixing in the process. here we are in modern day. Now we're starting to mix again in certain countries, not across the world, but America is the melting pot. It's one of the major places where look around and we're pretty mixed. I mean, I'm pretty mixed and I'm 36, but people younger than me are that much more likely to be ethnically mixed and for that to be a normal thing. So it's like I'm seeing how we're returning back to kind of how we originally were when we're all much more ethnically mixed, and now we're returning to that. And I think that's very symbolic of really what this channel is all about, where we can talk about that and discuss that and celebrate that. We're going back to where we came from, which is that mixed ethnicity, that melting pot where we came from. A lot of stuff happened in between there for a while and complicated things, but now we can return to being the kaleidoscope that we are of ethnicity.